the arguments we have about politics are not arguments where one side is trying to hurt the other on purpose or harm other people, right? They're trying to protect themselves. And so it challenges this idea, this destruction narrative that we have, right? We have a narrative that the other side is trying to destroy things, and it argues for a more hopeful narrative, the protection narrative.
Kurt, thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to starting this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we're going to start it off light. So my home church, West Raleigh, one of the hosts here, is situated near NC State's campus, about the same as we're situated here. And I want you to teach me, Kurt, how we can help these schools that tend to wear blue that are over on this side of the triangle to understand the objective fact that the best men's and women's basketball teams last year were the Wolfpack, right?
Last
year.
Yeah, I don't know.
Folks that's clearly the way it is?
Well, some rivalries are too deep to be touched.
That's why I took the NC State angle. Unfortunately, I have no ties to Duke or UNC.
That's right. I mean, with there, you can point to a scoreboard, perhaps, from last year. But I think I maybe want to take a step back and think about the goal of our kind of conversation and the goal of our conversations in the church or about politics or with your in-laws or what have you. And I think we often seek to persuade others to convince them that our side is the right side, and that's natural, that's human. And if you have strong moral convictions or sports convictions, right, you want to share those and try to bolster them. But I think my research, and I think what's ultimately best for society, is pluralism, a kind of appreciation that there are other sports viewpoints out there, right? And if we all cheered for the same team, wouldn't that be a very boring league, right? And so I think my research tries to focus on the importance of respect and having civil dialogue about our differences in a way that we can come to compromise and hopefully move our conversations forward, our churches forward, our society forward. So I think you can cheer for your side, and then we can have a civil conversation about, red or blue, and of course we know that dark blue is irredeemable.
That's fair, and I have to make a confession. My allegiances are to my alma mater in the Big Ten, so I really don't have an actual dog in this fight. But so help us understand a little bit. We've got these attachments to sports, but we have these other deep beliefs and values. How do they form? Like, what is going on cognitively and biologically and everything else, and how we come to form these deep beliefs?
Mm-hmm. So some of our deep beliefs are just a product of our social identity. So sports are a great example, right? If you were plopped here, you'd probably be a Tar Heel, and if you were,
and I'd agree with that statement about the dark blue. Yes,
right,
absolutely.
Right, exactly. And if you were plopped where you are, you would be an NC State fan. And so some of these allegiances are pretty minimal, right? But there are other values that are a little less minimal, our moral convictions. But even those two are ground in our groups, right? Our parents and our friends, they believe similar things, and we kind of support and reinforce those truths, right? Turns out that folks within a congregation probably have a certain view on certain topics. You go down the road to another congregation, you might disagree about things, right? So we've got some kind of social identity factors that really matter. But when it comes to our moral convictions, there are other things that underlie those things. And our moral beliefs are really grounded in, and I'm going to go evolutionary psychology here, this need for our groups to function and work together to get us to get along. And so there's this there's this potential. We all have kind of selfishness in our hearts, right? We want to take what we can for ourselves. But it doesn't work in groups when we all do that, right? We have to work together. We have to work for the common good. And so you need to have some kind of intuition, some feeling that doing those things is bad. And, if you are a person of faith, then that connects to your religion. But even folks who are not people of faith, right, have a sense that you shouldn't be selfish and that you should work together for the common good because that's the only way our societies survive. And so we all share these intuitions that we should work together and help others. But sometimes those intuitions lead us into slightly different places depending on the way that we see the world. And so I'll give you an example. It's contentious. So we all care that babies are protected, right? And many of us probably don't think that sperm have a rich life, right? That will think that contraceptive is probably okay. But in the gray area of things like a developing fetus, right? We disagree about how much mind, how much life is in there. And it's not to say that one person on one side or one person on the other side doesn't believe in protecting women or protecting life. It's more that they make these kind of assumptions about the world and who has a mind and who has a life. And based on those assumptions, you get these divergent moral beliefs, and then we start arguing, right? And then it seems like one side is evil and one side is not evil. That's my side, by the way. My side is always not evil, right? And then our social processes kind of ramp those up, and now we think that, well, there's only one truth, and even though we actually disagree about a small number of cases in real life, right? And I want to say, if you look at the legal books, 99.9% of those laws are uncontroversial, right? Like, we agree on almost everything when it comes to morality. But we think of these very small cases that are important, and we blow these up, and we get entrenched in our groups, and now we're polarized.
So is there something in common in those areas where we're polarized that links our deepest beliefs, whatever side we're on, or are they fundamentally somehow opposed? In terms of how we form them?
So I guess I'll give two answers. There's something in common with the issues that polarize us in general, and what's in common there is there are legitimate sources of suffering or victimization on both sides, right? So everyone here agrees that it's wrong to abuse children. The suffering is clear. No one takes the side of the evil stepfather who beats his stepdaughter, right? Like that, we all agree there. But when it comes to these more contentious issues, what allows us to take both sides in society is that there's some legitimate suffering on both sides. So immigration is a great example. It's a contentious example. It's probably going to be talked about tonight, right? And so there, everyone in America generally is pro-immigration. I'm an immigrant myself, right? I feel proud to have immigrated to America. But we disagree on a small number of cases, right? Undocumented migrants or illegal immigrants, depending on your political persuasion, coming over the border. And what we disagree on is whether we owe duty of care more to migrants or to U.S. citizens. And there's stories on both sides of the aisle of suffering. Kids being separated from their parents, U.S. citizens being murdered by drug cartels, right? And so you can see both sides and the suffering that people care about. And so that's what kind of unites all the issues that we're divided about. But of course, despite that division, there's still this kind of connection between people who are divided, and that is that we all care about protecting ourselves and our society from harm. We just disagree about who is most vulnerable to kind of victimization, who most needs our protection. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. And then, of course, once we have these different beliefs, again, social processes ramp up, and now I don't see you as someone who, I'm just pointing at you as if we disagree about everything, right? Now I don't see you as being a person who cares about protecting your family. I see you as someone who's an idiot and who's evil. And then once we're there, it gets really hard to have a conversation.
So do we understand that process from having our deep beliefs and that different sense of kind of whose suffering we value more? and when it leads to something like outrage or the heightened polarization that many of us feel and experience today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think we do know what leads to this moral disagreement. So you need some moral disagreement at first, right? To kind of, that's the little spark on the flame. And then the social processes kind of ramp it up. And there's lots of facts in modern life that really stoke this fire. So one is that we hardly ever talk to people who disagree with us. We're siloed in our social media bubbles, in our towns, in our communities. Our churches,
oftentimes.
right. Even communities within churches. I speak with churches that are divided, and it's even factions there. And so when you're not talking or interacting or seeing the humanity of someone who disagrees with you, it's easy to see them as someone other, right, as someone who's evil. And then you keep on talking to your side, and then, he's an idiot, right? Because you see how he parked? He went over the line a little bit. You know why he did that? Because he hates us, right? Not because you were busy, right? And so we have all these inferences that change the other person who's just trying to do their best in the world to someone who just hates freedom and wants to burn it all down, right? Like now you're a supervillain and you just want to see the world burn. But nobody wakes up in the morning saying, I'm evil and I want the world to burn, right? But these perceptions are what kind of separate us.
So let's step back.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear a little bit about what led you to psychology and led you into studying things like beliefs and polarization and trying to understand, some of the most difficult issues of our age.
So I wasn't always going to do psychology. It was what I was most interested in high school, but I was good at math and science, and psychology seemed squishy, I'll use a nice euphemism. And so I had a friend whose dad was buff, and he bow hunted and has a freezer full of moose in his house, and his girlfriend was very attractive. They were divorced. And I just thought, wow, this dude's amazing. I was a 16-year-old boy, I'm not making a lot of clear choices about my life. And he was a geophysicist. And so I decided to be a geophysicist and study rocks and where minerals and gas lives in the ground. And then as you mentioned, one night, I spent a whole semester working up almost in the Arctic, pounding stakes in the ground, driving snowmobiles, flying in helicopters, which was cool for a 19-year-old, don't get me wrong. But I realized I didn't care so much about rocks. I cared more about people because the problems that we really face in the world are about people. And so as I was thinking of switching majors, I kept on thinking about, psychology and our morals. And what kind of led me to moral psychology was I have a really big family in Nebraska. So my folks are separated, they're divorced. And then my father remarried a woman, my stepmother now. And she grew up in Nebraska from a very big, very evangelical family. And I grew up, vaguely agnostic in Canada, going to the United Church sometimes, like the Anglican styles. And when I was a kid, I would go down to Nebraska and hang with my cousins, and I would just think, wow, we have everything in common. We love swimming in lakes, we love playing in the barn, and we love riding horses. Great, right? And then as I got older, I realized that we were different in terms of what we thought about the world. And I remember learning about evolution and then going back to Nebraska and I was taking earth science and geophysics and talking about the age of the earth and dinosaur bones and radiocarbon dating and how do you know the earth is 4 billion and a half years old? And then my cousin's like, well, it's all just there to trick us. They're putting dinosaur bones in the earth to trick you and test your faith. There's a whole internally consistent idea of truth there, but it certainly wasn't my idea of truth. And so, so we're a little different. And then, we went to church, and then kids go in the basement, right? The adults go upstairs. We were for Sunday school, and I was a little younger here, and the Sunday school lesson was on baptism. Okay, I know about baptism. And the teacher asked, does anyone know what happens to people who aren't baptized? And I was not baptized. And the little boy, Jimmy, Little boy sticks up his hand. I know what happens. People aren't baptized. Teacher's like, yes, Jimmy. And he's like, they go to hell. And I felt a little like a setup, like a little like an ambush. This Canadian kid comes down, and the lesson is like, bad news, kid. And so I was a little affronted, but quickly I realized that this was not a setup to make me feel bad. Well, maybe it was, but it had good intentions behind it. And those good intentions were trying to bring me to the light, lead me to baptism, and ultimately, in the eyes of my family, save my soul. Right, and so my grandparents and my aunt and uncle, who were pastors, prayed for me every day. And it was hard not to feel loved, right? Even if we disagreed about, the kind of ultimate nature of things. And so I couldn't dismiss these folks, right, who vote Republican and who keep very different company than academics, right? I couldn't dismiss them as just stupid, because I know they weren't stupid. Right? And I couldn't dismiss them as evil because they opened their arms to me as like a foreigner and a stepkid, right? And so there's some dissonance here, and so I thought, well, they're good people. We clearly disagree, and so how can good people disagree? And I think that insight kind of like goes under a lot of my work, because you can't just say that the other side, half of America or half the world, is stupid or evil, right? There has to be something there that leads them to their beliefs and that is good in them. And so I think that insight has kind of always fueled my research on moral psychology, trying to understand how good people can disagree so much.
It's always one of the great pleasures of doing this work engaging science is hearing the stories that motivate the research that scientists do. They're powerful, powerful stories. So I want to give you a little time. I've done some work with academics. I know when you have publications coming out, you need to give some attention to them. So you've got a book coming out. Is it in January?
I do have a book in January, yeah.
So it's Outraged, Why We Fight About Morality and Politics. Can you give us a little preview of that book?
It's got a new longer subtitle.
Oh, I didn't
Why
catch
We
that.
Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground.
Okay.
So I think that, and it's pastor approved. I have a pastor friend in...
we have several pastors in here if you need more approval.
Yeah, totally.
We can try to get that.
In Oklahoma, and he read through it just to give me the kind of more theological perspective. So if that's a consideration, it's got a stamp,
Nice.
So that book is what we talked about, right? It's about why we're divided, why we're so outraged, and how to get a little less outraged. And ultimately, the idea is that the arguments we have about politics are not arguments where one side is trying to hurt the other on purpose or harm other people, right? They're trying to protect themselves. And so it challenges this idea, this destruction narrative that we have, right? We have a narrative that the other side is trying to destroy things, and it argues for a more hopeful narrative, the protection narrative, right? We're just trying to do your best to protect your family and yourselves. And so it talks about why we care so much about protecting ourselves. It digs into human nature. I feel like every psychology book has to talk about like who we are deep down. And this book argues that, we as a species are more about prey than predators. And there's lots of science to talk about this. You can look at the skulls of our ancestors. But I think the best example is you strip down naked and you go into a dark forest and see how you feel. You're not going to feel like a predator. You're not like, yeah, I can't wait for something to come out here and I'll jump on it and eat it, right? You think.
You're going to feel like you did with that lynx in northern Alberta.
Exactly, that's right. That's the part, You feel like something's stalking you, you feel threatened, right? And so we kind of live our lives a little afraid, right? We kind of look around and you check on social media and you're not like, yeah, I'm a predator on social media. I'm going to do things. You think like, oh my goodness, like things are terrible and like, what's the next terrible thing I'm going to read, right? Everything's terrible. And so it's about that kind of feeling, right? That feeling of like threat underlies why we get so angry. And I think it's useful to know that, right? Because everyone's a little afraid, and that's what drives their angry. They're not just like, they're not predators. They more feel like prey. And then once you realize about politics, you realize that about all sorts of arguments, right, in our everyday life. like PTA meetings. I just sent an email to our superintendent in Chapel Hill because there was some excitement at our elementary school. And there was some excitement with those email exchanges. Everyone, I think, felt a little outraged. And it was hard not to, right, as a human being. But also as an academic, I realized, like everyone just feels a little threatened, right, especially in today's age. And once you recognize that, once you recognize why your brother or your parents or your grandnephew, whatever, right, you realize that the reason they get outraged is because they feel threatened, they see harm. And I think the problem is, I mean, it's nice to know that, but the problem is, like, when you feel afraid and when you feel threatened, right, like, you just feel it in your heart and your body and everything, right? If you're in an argument with someone, like, you're just in your own body, you're in your own head. And it's almost impossible for you to recognize that the other person feels that way too. So you're like, I'm the true victim here, right? It's all me. And they feel it too. And so how do you navigate this? And one story I talk about in the book is when I was a teenager, I was driving, it was dark, and I cut off another car, and he clearly felt threatened because I almost knocked him into the median, and he almost died. And then he chased me through these like dark parking lots and cornered me in a loading dock and threatened to kill me. And so clearly I was feeling victimized there, right? I mean, it was Canada, he didn't have a gun, and so it just ended with me getting kind of slapped around and trying to get pulled out of my car. But at the end of the day, he said something like, well, you're the one who did something wrong here. And I was like, you literally assaulted me and threatened to kill me. And yet we both felt like we were righteous. And so that experience also kind of spurred on some of this research and some of this book. And so you have to think, well, how do you overcome those divides if we're like both feeling victimized? And one, don't have conversations about politics or in-laws or PTA or soccer when you're super angry.
So I shouldn't have led with that Duke, UNC,
yeah,
NC State.
Right. So, they say, like, don't go to bed angry. I think you could go to bed angry with your spouse, because probably having a conversation when you're full of rage is not the best time to have a conversation. But even if you do have to have a conversation, it turns out that the best way to have those conversations is not how we think. So when we have conversations about politics, we're like, you know what I need? Facts. I need some really good statistics. And then if I give you that statistic, you're going to be like, you know what? I'm wrong. I'm wrong about my view on abortion or immigration or taxes. You're right. That statistic was just too good. Said no one ever. So instead, what you need is you need stories. You need to let people get inside your own feelings of vulnerability. And so we have a ton of studies showing that if you're talking about morality, talking about disagreement, the best thing to do is to say, look, the reason that I have this belief is because, the reason I'm pro-gun, let's say, is because my mom defended herself from a home invasion with a handgun. And now you think, okay, I understand, right? I disagree with your position, and I think that there are statistics that argue against my position, but you think I'm rational. You don't think I'm stupid anymore, right? You don't think I'm evil. And so it turns out telling stories, especially stories of harm and vulnerability, are a good way to connect. And people don't always feel comfortable telling those stories. You might not. And so I think the biggest tip that I can give folks is that when you have these conversations, you want to see each other as a human, of course, but then you want to invite for understanding, right? You don't want to say, so how do you believe that, right? You want to say, I was wondering if you could, I know this is tough to talk about, but I know you voted differently than I did in the last election, and I'm trying to understand why. And I was hoping you could explain kind of like your feelings and thoughts for why you did that. Wow, that's a different conversation, right? And now people will volunteer those stories of vulnerability and really let you know what drives their moral beliefs.
So are there any other things we can do to begin to bridge some of what divides us, other than telling those stories? Are there other postures or approaches or virtues that we can cultivate or
Yeah, so for virtues, I think humility is an amazing virtue that we talk a lot about but seldom embody. right? Especially with morality, right? We talk about intellectual humility sometimes. The Templeton Foundation talks a lot about intellectual humility, but moral humility is kind of right? Is that like giving up your convictions? I don't think so. It's just recognizing that you might not be 100% right about everything. And going from 100 to 99 doesn't seem like much. It's just 1%. But that's a huge difference, to be an absolute right all the time, to thinking that there might be something that I could learn from you. And so I teach a class at UNC to fourth-year senior students about moral understanding, and I make them go out to their sorority houses, or they go home to talk to their grandparents, and they talk about things like abortion and systemic racism and euthanasia, whatever. We talk about all the hot button things. And one, they do an amazing job. So if you're afraid of the youth, don't be afraid. They're hungry for these conversations. They're good at it. They're excited. But two, we talk about moral humility, just the kind of recognition that like you could learn something from someone else. And the conversations are amazing. They write about them, and they're like, oh, I asked my grandpa what he thinks about racism, and it got a little heated, but at the end of it, I think we better understood each other, and we learned from each other. And I think that the commitment to learning and kind of trying to understand, I think that's the posture, right? I'm not trying to win in a debate. I'm trying to understand, and I think that's a powerful, powerful posture.
So you've got some church experience, familiarity. Any specific suggestions in kind of the unique context of churches of what we can do to cultivate some of those virtues and address some of the polarization, both in our personal lives and our communal lives, but even sometimes between our congregations and other communities?
Mm-hmm. So I do have a bunch of experience working with churches. There's one organization called One America Movement, which I can really recommend. They do a fantastic job of kind of within church dialogue and interfaith dialogue. But I think I'll fall back on science a little bit and talk about contact theory. So it's the oldest theory in social psychology when it comes to bridging divides, and it is all about how sustained positive contact among people who disagree is the best way to bridge divides. And so I think if you're a pastor or you lead a group or Bible study and you notice that there's some divisions, I think don't shy away from them. I think you can lean into them and get the people who disagree to kind of like talk about it, right? I think we're so afraid that someone's going to yell or get canceled or something like that we're like, let's just not talk about it. And I think once we're retreated into different, factions, we're in trouble, right? So I think you could lean into the conflict a little bit, but then you need guardrails, right? You need to set up a structure so that people feel safe and people feel comfortable telling their story. And so I work with one rabbi, and at her synagogue, it's a progressive synagogue, and there was one person there who was very much not against Black Lives Matter, but definitely in support of Blue Lives Matter. And she got a lot of heat from her congregation. It turns out that her husband is a police officer, right? And so she is trying to navigate this like tension of like wanting to be part of the congregation, but also feeling that like she's worried at the end of every day, is my husband going to come home? And so I think what helped that congregation was this understanding of like where she was coming from and allowing people to tell their stories and their vulnerabilities and share those. So I think it's the same recommendation, but kind of like the church is a special place where you can kind of like foster these norms, right? And I think you can do that.